What happens when an entire village decides to defy the most feared outlaws in Brazil, believing they can escape the shadow of the Congado by simply saying no? That question still echoes through the Sertão, because the truth is that defiance in those lands rarely ended with silence. It usually ended with screams. The moment a small, isolated community chose not to cooperate, they lit a fuse they did not fully understand, pulling themselves into a story that the region tried to bury for decades. And the first warning sign was not a gunshot. It was the unsettling stillness that settled over the Caatinga, as if even the wind knew something was coming. People in that village had heard the rumors. The outlaws were close, moving through the brush with their leather hats, Mauser rifles, and a reputation built on brutality and strategy. Yet the villagers convinced themselves that refusing food, shelter, and information would somehow protect them. Some blamed fear of the police, others insisted moral duty demanded resistance. But beneath every justification was a trembling uncertainty, because the Congado was not only a criminal movement, it was a system of power, a force that shaped the Sertão as much as drought and hunger did. When the first lookout spotted tracks near the riverbank, he felt a chill that no heat of the afternoon could erase. Those tracks meant surveillance. They meant the outlaws were studying them, calculating them, waiting, and that is where the real tension begins, because retaliation in the Sertão was never impulsive, it was methodical. The outlaws wanted to make examples, not simply enemies. They needed fear to travel faster than their horses. And nothing carried fear more effectively than a village that suffered for its refusal. Inside each home, whispers filled the night. Mothers tucked their children in with shaky hands. Fathers pretended to be calm while sharpening tools they knew would be useless if the bandits finally arrived. The priest, usually the voice of stability, avoided eye contact as he walked through the dusty roads, aware that prayers would not stop rifle barrels. A sense of collective dread grew thicker each day, and yet no one dared voice the thought that haunted all of them. Had they just doomed themselves by saying no to men who accepted nothing but obedience? What makes this story so disturbing is not only what happened next, but how many people outside that region never heard the full truth. So many parts were whispered behind closed doors. Others were erased by fear, rewritten by authorities, or softened by time. But the version that survived in the memories of the few who lived long enough to tell, it reveals a chain of events far darker than the official reports ever admitted. And understanding why the outlaws reacted the way they did begins with recognizing the psychological war they waged long before any violence erupted. And as we peel back these hidden layers, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered how a single decision, a single refusal, can reshape an entire community for generations? If this story already makes you question what really happened in that village, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, drop a like to support this kind of deep investigation, and check if you are subscribed so you do not miss the unfolding of this buried truth. Now let us move deeper into what those outlaws were preparing in the shadows, allowing the tension to build just enough to reveal the next piece of this hidden history. To understand why the outlaws reacted with such calculated fury, we need to look at the unwritten pact that shaped life in the Sertão for decades. Cooperation was not a matter of loyalty. It was survival. When a band like Lampiaus or Coriscos arrived at a settlement, they did not always need to state their demands. People already understood the rules: food, water, intelligence about police movements, and sometimes a place to rest. In exchange, the village earned a temporary shield. Outlaws protected those who helped them, or at least spared them. But behind that arrangement was an unspoken threat, a reminder that safety was borrowed, not earned. The Sertão lived in a tense balance where the police were distant. Justiça, unreliable, and danger could come from every direction. This fragile system meant that refusing cooperation was not merely an act of moral stance. It was a signal, a message that the village had aligned itself with another force, and for the Congacheros, whose survival depended on controlling territory and information, that message could not go unanswered. Outlaws navigated the harsh landscape using a combination of fear, respect, and an intricate network of informants. A village that resisted threatened all three pillars, creating a dangerous precedent. If one community could say no, others might feel brave enough to do the same. And that was unacceptable in a region where authority was enforced through reputation as much as violence. The villagers, meanwhile, underestimated how closely the outlaws monitored their movements. Every refusal, every whisper, and every hesitation traveled through the Sertão long before the bandits themselves arrived. Stories drifted on the wind, carried by merchants, cowherds, and even children who wandered between distant settlements. In this environment, privacy did not exist. A comment made in frustration at the market could reach the ears of someone tied to the Kangako by evening. So when the village tried to stand firm, believing their remoteness offered safety, the bandits had already catalogued their defiance, interpreting it as a direct challenge. Part of what made the Kangako so formidable was their ability to read fear. They understood when a community's resistance stemmed from moral conviction, desperation, or simple fatigue. And in this case, it was fear of the police that drove the villagers into a corner. For generations, the Sertão had been torn between outlaws and volantes, each using brutal tactics to impose their version of order. Caught in the middle, the people often chose whichever side arrived first or appeared strongest. The decision of this village, however, emerged from a rare collective impulse, the belief that maybe, just once, rejecting both sides could reclaim a sense of dignity. But dignity, in the Sertão, carried a steep price. As the outlaws continued to gather information, their perception of the situation shifted. What began as a minor inconvenience hardened into a strategic insult. The notion that a group of unarmed farmers and artisans could resist their authority became a psychological itch, one they needed to scratch before it spread. And while the village tried to convince itself that silence would buy forgiveness, the bandits interpreted that same silence as defiance, thickening into rebellion. Night after night, the tension grew heavier. People noticed unusual movements near the outskirts of the field's shadows lingering at the edge of visibility, horses heard but never seen, dogs barked at empty darkness, and children woke from restless dreams they could not explain. Every small disturbance seemed to hint at an approaching reckoning. The village's elders, aware of the danger, gathered in secret meetings, trying to predict what retaliation might look like. Yet even their worst fears did not come close to what the outlaws were preparing. And it was in that widening gap between fear and reality that the next phase of this buried story began to take shape, quietly but unmistakably. As days passed, the first undeniable sign that something was shifting came not from the outlaws themselves, but from the sudden disappearance of travelers along the main dirt road. People who normally crossed the region to sell leather, salt, or dried meat seemed to vanish from the routes near the village, as if warned to avoid that stretch of land. The absence of movement was louder than any threat. It meant eyes were watching. It meant someone was drawing a circle around the village, slowly tightening it. And the villagers felt it. Even the animals sensed it, becoming restless, refusing to graze near the outskirts, where the brush grew thick and silence hung unnaturally heavy. By late afternoon one day, a group of farmers returning from the fields noticed fresh boot prints near a creek. They were too symmetrical, too purposeful to belong to ordinary travelers. Cangaceiro boots had a peculiar weight to them, a pattern recognized across the circle. When the men exchanged looks, each of them understood without speaking that these tracks meant more than a passing presence. They meant surveillance, and where surveillance appeared, demands and punishment usually followed. Still, no direct encounter occurred. The silence from the scrubland was more unsettling than gunfire. Inside the village, fear forged strange alliances. People who rarely spoke were now sharing information in hushed tones behind half-closed doors. At night, figures could be seen near windows, listening for distant hooves or the metallic click of rifles being prepared. Every sound became suspicious. A shifted tile on a roof, a sudden gust that rattled a wooden shutter, the faint cry of an animal. Families began pulling their children indoors earlier each evening, trying to create the illusion of safety even though everyone knew walls made of mud and straw offered no protection against men who carried dynamite and long-range rifles. Still, the villagers clung to an unusual sense of stubbornness. Some believed the outlaws might simply move on if ignored. Others placed their hope in the police, assuming the presence of volantes somewhere in the region might deter the congacheros from attacking. But the Sertao did not work that way. Outlaws and police alike understood that control depended on fear, and both sides punished disobedience harshly. A village that refused to cooperate risked drawing fire from both directions, a reality no official map or government decree ever acknowledged. Rumors soon began to circulate that the outlaws were camped less than 2 leagues away. A traveling merchant who passed through another settlement days earlier reportedly heard the band discussing a lesson that needed to be taught. He would not elaborate further, his hands shaking as he spoke, but the implication was clear enough. The village had been marked, and marking meant preparation. Cangaceros did not attack without purpose. They observed, they planned, they waited for darkness or distraction, choosing their moment carefully. At dusk, smoke was seen rising from the distant hills, too thin to be a wildfire and too steady to be an accident. It looked like a signal, the kind bandits used to communicate across distances without revealing their exact location. Elders recognized it immediately, their faces turning ashy. Children were pulled indoors, livestock secured, candles extinguished earlier than usual. The village descended into a tense quiet, the kind that stretches every minute into an hour. People tried to sleep, but few succeeded. Bodies lay awake on stiff mattresses, listening for footsteps in the dust outside. What made the atmosphere even more unnerving was the absence of any direct message. The outlaws said nothing, demanded nothing, made no threats. Their silence was deliberate, a psychological tactic designed to erode the villagers. Resolve? And as fear tightened its grip, every person in that settlement began to understand, slowly and painfully, that the refusal they had once framed as courage had become a beacon for danger. The question was no longer whether retaliation would come, but how devastating it would be and how long the village could withstand the shadow moving toward them with unmistakable intent. By the time the villagers realized the silence surrounding them was intentional, not accidental, it was already too late to undo the decision that had placed them in the crosshairs of the outlaws. The air itself felt different in those days, thicker, as if the Sertao were holding its breath alongside the people trapped in that fragile settlement. Even the elders, who had lived through droughts, raids, and epidemics, struggled to explain the sensation. It was not fear of the unknown. It was fear of the inevitable, the knowledge that something had already been set in motion, something they had no means to stop, created a tension that gnawed at them day and night. The priest attempted to restore calm by organizing evening gatherings for prayer, but the villagers could see it in his hands. The subtle tremor when he held the rosary, the quick glance over his shoulder whenever a dog barked. He was no more certain than the rest of them, and the lack of certainty fed the anxiety that spread through the community like wildfire. People began locking their doors earlier each night, though everyone knew locks meant nothing to men who carried axes and explosives. Families whispered about fleeing, but leaving the village in the dead of night felt just as dangerous as staying. The outlaws could be anywhere, watching from the brush, perched behind rocks, studying every movement with the patience of predators. The final breaking point came during a council meeting held behind the old storage shed, the only place where conversations were not easily overheard. The village leaders argued bitterly. Some insisted that they should send an emissary to negotiate, offering what supplies they could gather. Others believed that reaching out would only confirm their fear. A third group, smaller but vocal, urged complete resistance, claiming that the outlaws would interpret any gesture of surrender as weakness. But beneath all the shouting lay an uncomfortable truth. None of them had a real solution. They were improvising against seasoned fighters who had survived ambushes, drought, and decades of pursued by heavily armed police units. As the debate dragged on, a strange quiet fell upon the meeting. It was as if the entire group sensed the same realization at the same time. The outlaws were not waiting for negotiations. They were waiting for the village's resolve to crack, for fear to break open its foundations so completely that any retaliation would feel like a preordained punishment rather than revenge. It was psychological warfare at its most precise, and slowly, painfully. The villagers began to understand that their act of refusal had not been seen as courage. It had been seen as insolence, a direct provocation to men who ruled vast regions through fear, unpredictability, and swift punishment. Late that night, as lanterns cast long shadows across the ground, a single gunshot echoed from somewhere beyond the fields. It was distant but unmistakable. Families jolted awake, freezing in place, straining to identify the source. Then came a second sound, softer, like the snap of a branch, and then nothing. The silence returned just as quickly as it had been broken, sending a colder shiver through every home. These were not random sounds. They were warnings, subtle reminders that the bandits dictated the timeline now, not the villagers. And though no one could see them, everyone felt their presence closing in, drawing tighter with each passing night. What made the situation even more unbearable was the creeping suspicion that someone inside the village might have already broken beneath the pressure. Whispers suggested that one or two villagers, desperate to save their families, could have slipped away to negotiate secretly. Others speculated that a local trader had betrayed them days earlier, leaking details about their refusal to the outlaws. The lack of trust spread like poison, turning neighbors into suspects and transforming every conversation into a delicate dance between fear and accusation. Whether these rumors were true or not hardly mattered. The unity the village once relied upon was fracturing exactly when they needed it most. And it was in this fragile, unstable atmosphere that the first undeniable signs of the outlaws' preparation finally emerged. Not through confrontation, but through the subtle pressure that pushed the village toward the edge of collapse. Their defiance, once viewed with pride, now felt like a weight no one knew how to carry. And the question that haunted them all was whether there was still time to avoid the storm gathering just beyond the reach of their lanterns. If this part of the story stirred something in you, or reminded you of how fear reshapes entire communities, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps keep these forgotten histories alive. By the time dawn broke the next morning, the village felt like a place suspended between two worlds. The sun rose normally, spilling light over the fields, but nothing about the scene felt natural. People stepped outside with caution, scanning the horizon before daring to approach their chores. Every movement seemed rehearsed, as if the villagers were trying to convince themselves that the routine of daily life could protect them from what everyone sensed was approaching. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm of roosters crowing and goats bleating, there was an undercurrent of terror they could no longer ignore. One of the farmers discovered that a boundary fence had been cut clean through during the night. The cut was precise, deliberate, not the work of animals or wandering travelers. Another villager found footprints near the well, leading from the brush to the outer homes, and then back into the Katinga. These were not random intrusions. They were reconnaissance, subtle reminders that someone had been close enough to observe the village in silence. It was the kind of intrusion designed to unsettle, to force the villagers to confront the fact that their borders meant nothing. As more signs surfaced, fear began to manifest in physical ways. People spoke in shorter sentences, their voices tense, their breaths shallow. Children clung to their parents. Even the animals behaved strangely. Dogs whined for no reason. Chickens refused to wander far, and the horses shifted nervously in their stalls as if sensing predators in the wind. The village was being encircled not by visible force, but by anticipation itself. And anticipation, in how often proved more destructive than the violence that followed. The elders met again, this time in a smaller, quieter gathering. Their faces were drawn, eyes ringed with exhaustion. They debated whether to send scouts into the surrounding brush to confirm the outlaws' positions, but none of them could bring themselves to order such a task. To walk into that wilderness now felt like walking willingly into a trap. And even if they found where the outlaws were hiding, what then? They had no weapons capable of matching the firepower of seasoned bandits. Their arguments circled endlessly, weighted by the knowledge that every hour brought the threat closer. Meanwhile, along the edge of the village, subtle changes in the environment suggested that the outlaws were preparing not just for retaliation, but for a demonstration. Tracks of multiple horses appeared overnight, looping strategically, suggesting positions from which the bandits could surround the settlement. Small markers carved into tree trunks hinted at coded messages only members of the Congo would understand. It became clear that the outlaws were communicating across distance, coordinating movements with precision. They were not acting out of impulse. They were staging something with intent. As the villagers absorbed these unsettling signs, an eerie pattern emerged. The outlaws were tightening their grip without ever revealing themselves fully. They wanted the village to crumble under the weight of its own fear. They wanted the psychological collapse to happen before the physical one. Every villager began living in a state of dual awareness, performing daily tasks to maintain a sense of normalcy while keeping one ear tuned to the slightest anomaly in the distance. It was a draining existence, a quiet erosion of resilience. But beneath the fear, another emotion flickered. Regret, not necessarily for refusing the outlaws' demands, but for misjudging the consequences. The decision, made with conviction and moral clarity, had begun to warp under the pressure of what they now understood they had triggered. People who once spoke proudly of standing firm had fallen silent, and as the sun dipped again behind the distant hills, shadows stretched across the houses in long, unsettling lines, as if marking the final hours before something irreversible would begin. The village had entered a waiting period, a tense stillness that felt like the tightening of a bowstring pulled to its limit, moments before release. As the final layers of daylight slipped away, the village entered a darkness thicker than any it had known before. It was not just the night sky or the shadows cast by the jagged shapes of the it was the collective awareness that whatever the outlaws intended was no longer distant or theoretical. The atmosphere had the oppressive stillness that precedes a storm, the kind that makes every sound feel amplified and every silence feel like a warning. People moved through their homes with slow, cautious gestures, as if afraid that even the scrape of a chair on the floor might draw attention. The air felt heavy, dense, with the tension of what had not yet happened but unquestionably would. Shortly after midnight, the first unmistakable sign arrived. A low, rhythmic thud echoed from beyond the northern ridge, steady and deliberate, like someone testing the ground with the butt of a rifle. Dogs throughout the village erupted in frantic barking, only to fall silent moments later as if struck by an unseen command. Lanterns were extinguished at once. Families huddled together in the dark, listening with wide eyes and shallow breaths. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the distant sound itself. No one spoke. No one dared to move. It was clear that the outlaws were on the outskirts, probing the boundaries of the settlement, testing whether anyone was awake or foolish enough to step outside. The villagers waited. Minutes dragged by like hours. Then came another sound, sharper this time, the crack of a twig, followed by the faint metallic rattle of equipment being adjusted. This was no longer reconnaissance. It was positioning. The outlaws were taking their places, preparing the layout of an assault with the methodical calm of people accustomed to violence. Their silence was intentional, a silence crafted to stretch the nerves of their targets to the breaking point. For the villagers, every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to plead, but none of those options felt real. They were trapped in their own homes, prisoners of a decision that now loomed over them with crushing clarity. Inside one of the houses, an elderly man whispered a prayer under his breath, barely audible even to himself. He had lived long enough to witness raids from both police and bandits, but he sensed something different now. This was not an occupation or a demand for supplies. This had the weight of an execution, a punishment designed to restore the authority of outlaws who had been publicly His voice trembled as he finished the prayer, not because he doubted its power, but because he feared it would be the last one he ever spoke. Suddenly, a flash of light flickered on the hillside. It was small, almost delicate, but unmistakably intentional. A signal. One of the villagers watching through a narrow slit in the wall inhaled sharply. That light meant communication between the bandits, a silent confirmation that all units were in place. Moments later, the muffled sound of hooves carried across the dry earth, not a chaotic gallop, but the controlled advance of riders tightening the circle around their target. The village was being enveloped, its exits sealed without a single shout or shot. The outlaws were demonstrating their dominance through precision rather than noise. The first real moment of contact came in the form of a shadow passing across a window. It moved slowly, confidently, as if the person behind it knew the fear they were causing. A child gasped, and the mother clasped her hand over the little mouth before another sound could escape. Footsteps scraped against the dirt just outside the door. Then came another set, and then another. The bandits were spreading out, mapping the positions of each hut by hand, identifying which ones housed men who might attempt resistance and which ones contained families unlikely to fight back. The tension reached a level so intense it felt like a physical pressure in the chest of every person awake. People tried to control their breathing, to remain absolutely still, as if motion itself could invite disaster. Every wooden plank, every clay wall, every thatched roof became a fragile barrier against forces no villager had the means to withstand. And yet, despite the overwhelming danger, no attack came immediately. The outlaws were delaying it on purpose. They wanted the villagers to feel the full weight of anticipation, to understand that the consequence of defiance was not quick but lingering, an inescapable descent into dread. When the footsteps finally faded back into the darkness, replaced by silence once more, it became clear that this night was not meant for violence. It was meant for terror. The outlaws were preparing something far more devastating than a surprise attack. They were constructing a psychological collapse, step by step, ensuring that when the moment of retaliation finally arrived, the villagers would already be broken from within. And as the first hints of dawn crept across the horizon, no one felt relief. Only the chilling understanding that the worst had not yet begun when dawn finally broke. It did not bring clarity or comfort. Instead, it revealed the village under a strange, unnatural quiet, the kind that follows a night in which everyone remained awake but no one dared to speak. The sunlight exposed the signs of visitation, disturbed soil, faint impressions of knees where men had crouched, ashes from torches extinguished in haste, and a single leather strap left near a doorway, unmistakably crafted in the style of the Kangasit. Whoever had walked the perimeter hours earlier had done so with intention. They had studied the layout, memorized the paths between the huts, and traced the places where fear lived deepest. The villagers understood now that the outlaws had not simply been near. They had been among them. It did not take long for word of the strap to spread. By mid-morning, a tight crowd had formed around it. No one brave enough to touch it, yet no one willing to walk away. The object felt symbolic, almost ritualistic, as if it had been left behind as a message. A reminder not of the attack to come, but of the power the bandits already held. For the first time, some villagers began to openly question the wisdom of their resistance. Their earlier resolve, once described as moral courage, now felt fragile, thin as parchment in the face of what they had witnessed. Yet, no one could reverse the decision. The door they had closed on the outlaws could not be reopened without consequence. By afternoon, the psychological pressure intensified. A flock of vultures circled overhead, unsettling the children and unnerving the elders. The birds had likely been attracted by the scent of leftover food or a recently slaughtered animal. But in the minds of the villagers, everything held meaning now. Superstition blurred with fear. Even natural occurrences felt like omens. And, as the day wore on, the oppressive heat brought with it a sense of suffocation, as though the very air conspired to remind them of their helplessness. Then, without warning, a series of distant shouts echoed from the ridge. Not cries for help, nor the aggressive yells of forming attack lines. These were short, coded calls, the type used by congacheros to coordinate movement across distances. Every villager froze. Children clung to their mothers. Men who tried to appear calm felt their hands tremble. The calls came in intervals, each one distinct, each answered by another, more distant voice. It was communication, strategy in motion, a gradual tightening of the net around the settlement. The villagers did not need to understand the meaning of each call to grasp the intention. The outlaws were preparing a demonstration, not just of violence but of power so overwhelming that no one would ever consider defiance again. As the echoes faded, another unsettling detail emerged. Some of the tracks left near the village were so fresh that the edges were still crisp, untouched by wind. This meant the outlaws had returned at dawn, slipping through the brush while the villagers gathered in their homes, too afraid to step outside. They had watched the sunrise from the shadows. They had listened to the whispers drifting from windows. They had stood close enough to hear the creak of doors and the shuffle of feet inside. Their patience was a weapon, and they wielded it with the precision of men who understood that terror softens the ground long before violence breaks it. The elders attempted to restore order by calling a meeting, but their voices shook, their authority weakened by the weight of the unknown. No plan emerged. No strategy felt realistic. They could not flee without being hunted down. They could not fight without guaranteeing slaughter. And they could not negotiate without admitting their mistake. The villagers found themselves trapped in a psychological labyrinth, unable to move in any direction without stepping deeper into danger. Panic flickered behind their eyes, not yet visible in their actions, but growing, expanding, like a fire burning low before erupting. As the sun dipped once more and long shadows crept across the ground, many began to wonder whether the outlaws were deliberately delaying the inevitable, drawing out the suspense to break the village from within. It was a tactic the Kangako had perfected over decades, to let fear do the work long before the blade or bullet was used. And the village, exhausted and fractured, was already bending under that weight. The only question left was how far the outlaws intended to push before unleashing the retaliation that all knew was coming. If any detail in this unfolding tension made you reflect on how fear can dismantle even the strongest communities, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and add your voice to this story that was nearly erased from history. By the time night settled again over the village, the tension had reached an almost unbearable threshold. It was no longer just fear of what the outlaws might do, but fear of what the villagers themselves were becoming under the pressure. Every conversation held in shadows carried a different tone, now short-clipped, saturated with suspicion. People exchanged glances that asked silent questions. Who among us will break first? Who might already be talking to them? The erosion of trust was not loud or chaotic. It was slow, incremental, like water carving channels through stone. And the outlaws depended on this erosion as much as they depended on their rifles. A fractured village was easier to dominate than a unified one. Whispers began to surface about strange noises heard in the distance, the metallic clink of cooking pots, the murmur of low voices, the soft whinny of horses. These were small, scattered sounds, but in a landscape where silence had become the primary language of intimidation, each noise felt deliberate. The villagers lay awake on their straw mattresses, their senses sharpened by dread, trying to decipher whether the sounds were real or imagined. The human mind, when pushed past its limits, begins to fill in the void between fear and reality. And in this village, imagination was becoming as dangerous as the threat itself. At sunrise, a group of men gathered near the well to discuss what they believed to be an inevitable attack. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. Some argued that the outlaws were waiting for reinforcements, preparing a larger force to make an example out of the settlement. Others believed the bandits were already stationed around the perimeter, intentionally prolonging the suspense to test how long the village could endure before collapsing. But the most unsettling theory came from a quiet man who rarely spoke. He suggested that the bandits were waiting for the villagers to turn on one another to break down completely, making the eventual punishment almost unnecessary. His words were met with silence, not because the idea was absurd, but because it felt uncomfortably plausible. The day unfolded with a heavy sense of anticipation. Children played less. Adults worked half-heartedly, moving through tasks with a mechanical detachment. Even the animals seemed affected. Cows refused to graze near the northern ridge, and the chickens clustered together as if seeking companionship in the rising tension. It was as though the entire village had entered a state of animation, waiting for a signal that would determine their fate. Yet the signal never came. The outlaws remained invisible, their presence felt but not seen, their intentions unreadable. By late afternoon, a gust of wind carried the faint scent of smoke across the settlement. It was not the smell of burning wood from a household fire. It was harsher, tinged with something acrid, as if brush had been set alight intentionally somewhere in the distance. Several villagers climbed small reses near the edge of the Caatinga, scanning the horizon for clues. Nothing visible appeared, but the scent lingered, drifting through the village like a warning. Some interpreted it as preparation, a way for the outlaws to clear ground or signal their location. Others saw it as psychological manipulation, another layer of tension added to a situation already stretched thin. As dusk approached, a sense of inevitability settled over the community. People moved more slowly, as if conserving energy for whatever might come next. The elders, usually pillars of strength, appeared worn and defeated. Their leadership had been grounded in experience, but no past hardship resembled the psychological siege the village now endured. One elder admitted quietly that he had hoped the outlaws would attack swiftly, believing a brief confrontation, however brutal, would be easier to endure than the prolonged uncertainty that had suffocated the village for days. His admission shocked those who heard it, but many secretly agreed. Night arrived with oppressive weight. Candles flickered inside the huts, their light barely strong enough to push back the shadows. Families gathered in silence, listening for footsteps, voices, anything that might signal the next stage of their ordeal. The stillness outside felt unnatural, almost staged, and in that stillness, a collective realization began to take shape. Whatever the outlaws were preparing, it was not merely an act of retaliation. It was a demonstration, a message crafted not only for this village, but for every settlement that dared imagine defiance. And as the darkness deepened, the villagers sensed they were standing at the threshold of something far worse than they had imagined. A moment suspended between dread and the unknown. As the oppressive darkness stretched across the settlement, the villagers could no longer tell whether the stillness outside was natural or deliberately crafted. The silence had weighed to the point where even breathing felt like a disturbance. The outlaws had mastered this kind of psychological pressure, creating an environment where fear did not come from what was seen, but from what could not be seen. And by now, the villagers understood that invisibility was part of the strategy. The absence of attack had become its own kind of assault, wearing them down hour by hour until exhaustion blurred the line between reality and imagination. Throughout the night, muffled murmurs drifted from house to house. Families whispered theories about the outlaws' intentions, their voices trembling with each guess. Some believed the bandits were waiting for a specific moment, perhaps when the moon reached its highest point or when the settlement sank into its deepest vulnerability. Others thought the outlaws were watching to see who among the villagers would try to flee, ready to intercept them and use them as examples. Every possibility felt equally plausible and equally terrifying. The villagers had lost their ability to predict anything, and in that vacuum, fear took control. By early morning, sleep had become a luxury no one trusted. Men who once prided themselves on resilience now sat slumped against walls, eyes half-lidded, waking at the slightest movement. Mothers held their children close, shielding them not from violence, but from the mental unraveling spreading through the community. And as the sun began to creep over the horizon, it illuminated a landscape that felt different, altered by the collective dread that had saturated it. The village looked the same, yet it no longer felt familiar. It felt like a place marked. Later that day, an unexpected development stirred the settlement. A torn scrap of cloth, decorated with leather stitching typical of Cangachero attire, was discovered snagged on a thorny branch near the southern path. Unlike the strap found earlier, this piece appeared intentionally placed. The stitching contained a subtle pattern, one recognized by those who had lived long enough to understand the symbols used by the outlaws. It was not a warning. It was confirmation, a sign that the village's refusal had traveled through the network of bandits, reaching figures of authority within the This meant the retaliation would not be random or impulsive. It would be orchestrated. The discovery spread rapidly and shattered whatever fragile stability remained. Conversations grew tense. Small arguments erupted over nothing. Even The elders struggled to maintain order, and in the chaos came another blow. A pair of men claimed they had seen movement near the dry riverbed, shadows slipping silently across the bank, moving with the ease of people who knew every contour of the land. Whether the sighting was real or a trick of the exhausted mind hardly mattered. The image took root in the village's collective consciousness, amplifying the dread that had been building for days. But perhaps the most unsettling moment came near dusk, when several villagers heard what sounded like laughter carried on the wind, faint, distant, but unmistakably human. It rose and fell in a haunting cadence, the kind of sound that might have been harmless in another context, but, under these conditions, sliced through the air like a blade. Whether it truly came from the outlaws or was a distortion shaped by fear, no one could say, but it reinforced a single, chilling truth. The psychological siege was reaching its peak. As darkness returned, once more, the village found itself in a state of suspended terror, hovering between anticipation and inevitability. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown. Every whisper of wind felt like a signal. And somewhere beyond the reach of their flickering lanterns, the outlaws were still watching, still waiting, allowing the dread to settle so deeply that it would leave scars long before the first rifle was fired. As the final night settled over the village, the air felt charged with an uneasy electricity, as though the land itself braced for what was coming. Every hut remained dark, every whisper muted, every movement controlled. The villagers sensed something had shifted in the silence, that it no longer carried the slow, suffocating dread of the previous days but had sharpened into a poised, expectant edge. The outlaws had spent long enough tightening their psychological grip. Now the tension felt differently weighted, almost purposeful. It was the kind of quiet that descends only when every piece of a plan has fallen into place. Shortly after midnight, a faint glimmer appeared along the ridge's small flare of light, too brief to identify, too precise to be accidental. Those awake in the village held their breath, listening. The sound that followed was not loud, not even violent. It was the subtle, unmistakable clicking of metal against metal, carried softly through the wind. Rifles being prepared, equipment being adjusted. The outlaws were no longer observing. They were positioning themselves for something final, something deliberate. Inside the huts, families gathered in silence, hearts pounded under rib cages, beating out a rhythm that matched the looming threat. Moments stretched, elastic and trembling, as villagers strained to read the night. Then came another sound, a slow, dragging scrape along the edge of the settlement. It moved methodically, passing each hut like a grim inspection. It could have been a boot, or the end of a rifle, or even a machete, tracing a line in the dirt. Whatever it was, its intention was unmistakable. The outlaws wanted the villagers to know they were no longer circling, they were area. From the northern edge, a soft whistle broke the stillness. It rose briefly, then cut sharply, as if signaling a countdown no villager could decipher. The outlaws had mastered the art of coordination, communicating through gestures and sounds that the untrained ear could never interpret. Another whistle answered from the south. Then one from the east. And finally, one from the west. The village was surrounded, not by chaos, but by calculated precision. Yet even then, no attack came. Instead, the outlaws let the silence return, thicker and colder than before. They understood that the most devastating blows were often the ones that landed before any weapon was drawn. The villagers, standing on the brink of collapse, began to realize that the retaliation they had feared might be far more complex than a night of gunfire. Perhaps the bandits wanted to break their spirit, to reshape their memory of defiance into a warning for every other settlement across the surface. Perhaps the true punishment was not destruction, but transformation, a story etched into their identity forever. Hours passed in suspended dread. Gradually, the villagers noticed the faint sounds of movement fading into the distance. Hooves, boots, the click of equipment. It was as if the outlaws were retreating, slipping back into the darkness with the same ghost-like precision they had used to arrive. The villagers waited for a trick, a sudden reversal, a final burst of violence, but none came. The night held its breath, and in that stillness, a new kind of terror settled in, uncertainty. By sunrise, the outlaws were gone. No confrontation, no fire, no massacre. Only the echo of days spent under psychological siege, the marks on the earth where men had stood, and the knowledge that their restraint was not kindness but strategy. The village had been taught its lesson not through bloodshed, but through fear so deep it would be spoken of for generations. The truth they tried to bury was not the violence itself, but the fact that the mere threat of retaliation had been enough to tear the village apart from within, and as the villagers stepped cautiously back into the daylight, they understood that survival came with a price. Their choice to resist had changed them forever. The outlaws did not need to destroy the village to claim victory. They needed only to make it remember. If you stayed with this story until the end, feel welcome to share your voice in the comments using the phrase "I am with you until the end," so I know you reached this point. And if this deep look into the shadows of the Sertão helped you understand a forgotten piece of Brazil's history, consider subscribing and leaving a like to support more stories like this. There is another video here that continues exploring the hidden truths behind these outlaw legends, so feel free to click and keep walking with me through the parts of history most people never dare to revisit.